Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's move on to considering what we have covered during the course. I want to suggest that one important idea we've attempted to get over to you is that phonetics is dynamic, pronunciation is dynamic rather than static. When you read descriptions in books, they tend to be descriptions of static positions. To make a TH sound, you place your tongue between your, against your upper teeth or whatever with the soft palate raised, describing a position. The vowel so-and-so is produced with the lips like this and the tongue in this and this position. Well, this is fine. But in real life, when we talk, everything is moving all the time. So we've got to make this transition, putting things together, seeing how they are actually parts of movements. And it isn't even that we go jerkily from one position to another, though that's the sort of halfway way of envisaging it. In real life, everything is moving sort of rather smoothly, and it's a miracle how we do manage to produce things that we can perceive as a succession of sounds, each sound being a kind of moment, position, snapshot. We've been looking at sounds from two points of view, from the point of view of perceiving them and the contrast between them, and of course also producing them, reproducing them, performing them, and the differences between them. We've given you practice in all of these things. In particular, we've given you daily ear training sessions where, well, different teachers have done different things, no doubt, but in my ear training sessions, what we did was sets of similar words that cause confusion, correction, collection, that kind of thing, pan and pen, that kind of thing, sheep and ship. We took them in groups of 4 similar words. We also had nonsense words, which were based on English sounds, although not actually real English words. They're good practice because, okay, in real life, you have information from the context. You have to make sense of the whole sentence, and so you, in a sense, can ignore the actual sounds. When we have nonsense words, there is no context, so you have to concentrate on getting the sounds accurately. And that should feed back to listening comprehension in real life. We've also worked on connected English, where we've seen all the various phenomena that take place in connected speech, as well as being able to identify stress patterns and intonation patterns. In performing sounds, we have had to engage in what's sometimes called articulatory gymnastics. Professor Taniguchi has shown some ways of being gymnastic in the classroom with tones and so on, but you can also do it with segments, and some of you have ideas how to do this. I'm not really thinking about bodily gymnastics, I'm thinking about the subtle movements of the organs of speech, which we do have to perform in order to make sounds correctly. We're all very used to the sounds of our own native language. We have undergone years and years of training in producing that, but we may be a bit rusty in making the movements necessary for foreign languages. So we have to do training for that. Just as if you were going to do bodily gymnastics, you have to train regularly so as to be able to perform those movements and to make them automatic, to automate them, so you don't have to think about them so much. Okay, it's a matter of sounds, individual sounds, speech sounds. It's a matter of contrasts, making the necessary distinctions in the language you're learning, in this case English, and putting them together, the phonotactics we discussed, which in particular means mastering the idea of final consonants and consonant clusters. Here's one of the contrasts then, especially for Northeast Europeans, pen and pan, so she's got a pen and the egg is in a pan. Which is the pen? That one. Which is the pan? This one. Is this the pan? Yes, it is. Is that the pen? Yes. Is that the pan? No. And so on and so on. And I hope that those of you who are teachers have seen how you can incorporate this into a lesson without making a big fuss about it. You don't have to say, right, now we're going to study phonetics. No, you just, when you come across a word that causes confusion or which people are mispronouncing, you stop and you do some practice on pen and pan, or sheep or ship, or red or lead, or whatever it might be, van or van, and practice it. Practice hearing it and practice producing it. This is another one that I don't think we discussed explicitly in lectures, especially a problem for Swedes and some other Scandinavians, but also for the Spanish. The difference between y and j, not helped by the choice of phonetic symbols that we use. Where we need to distinguish between a yam, which is a tropical vegetable, and jam, which is a fruit. One of them is the yam, the other one is jam, which is the jam, which is the yam. And then, down at the bottom left, we have a yolk, the yellow part of the egg, the yolk. And on the right, we have a joke. One is a yolk and the other is a joke. Now, Spanish people on the whole can make both of these sounds, but the problem is that they treat j as an emphatic variety of y. And of course, that's not how it works in English. You would say that the yellow part of the egg is called a yolk, a yolk, a yolk. It's still not going to turn into a joke. Equally, this is a joke, and you say it very, very quickly as a joke, it's still not going to be a yolk. I'm not going to read out the joke to you, you read it yourself. All right, phonotactic. Clusters, consonant clusters. Here are some initial consonant clusters. If your language doesn't have clusters or doesn't have those clusters, these may require work. So we've got pray, we've got bread, we've got train. The TR-DR ones make a special kind of affricate in English. Train, drive, and so on. We've got queen. We've got three consonants in certain clusters beginning with S in English, as in splash. Splash. Those are word initial, syllable initial consonant clusters. We have word medial consonant clusters, or some people think they're not clusters but just sequences. In whiskey, doctors with T, KT, Scotland with TL. We have discussed in my lectures some of the special problems associated with consonants in these kinds of sequences. You can't hear usually the explosion of the K in doctors. You may get a glottal stop in Scotland, or alternatively a natural release of the T in Scotland. And then we've got final consonant clusters. So there's some milk. We saw how the new habit of vocalizing the L beginning to come in may mean that this ceases to be a consonant cluster and gives us instead a new diphthong as milk. You have to make a judgment whether we have yet reached the stage when you can allow your students to say milk in common with millions of people in the southeast of England. Lamp, that's an easy consonant cluster for most people. Left, that's perhaps a bit trickier. Left. Fox, not too much problem there. Wasp, yeah, the problem is, of course, you can have more than one wasp. And that gives us wasps. 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 Have we got it with an S? Yes, there we have it. See, wasps. Wasps. By the way, those of you tempted to use PowerPoint in lectures or classes, it doesn't allow you to do all sorts of jolly games like this. But my advice is don't overdo it. Don't do it too much. Keep it for special effects like that. Okay, perception and production of sound. There's also the general problem of spelling and pronunciation. who are learning Finnish or Swedish or even Spanish really don't have much of a problem working out from the spelling what the pronunciation will be. The converse problem of working out from the pronunciation what the spelling might be might have one or two little traps in Spanish, but again is absolutely straightforward in Finnish or Swedish. Well, nearly. In English, this is notoriously not the case. And in particular, English spelling, as we saw in the introductory lecture, can quite often be misleading. This is really why we advise your learners to make use of a dictionary, either a general dictionary, or if they are particularly concerned with pronunciation, a pronunciation dictionary, pronouncing dictionary, and look words up. And the general advice is, when you learn a new item of English vocabulary, you should learn the pronunciation with it. This is parallel to the advice given to English learners of French, German, Russian, Polish, where we're advised every time we learn a new noun to learn the gender with it, because otherwise you know the word and you won't know the gender. So with English you don't need to bother with gender, but you do need to bother with pronunciation. So learn it along with the new word. We've tried to give you some useful rules and warned you of one or two traps. If you don't take this advice, you are very likely to be misled by the spelling. You want to say something is marvelous, is it? Well, that's how it's spelt. We don't, of course, say marvelous or marvelous or anything like that. That OUS at the end, well, Greeks or Turks or various other Arabs, learners of English, often think that OUS means oos, but it doesn't. It's just a way of spelling S with a schwa. So this word is pronounced marvellous or marvellous. It's one of the words subject to compression, which we explained. It can be marvellous, but in real life it's usually marvellous. Or in American English, marvellous or marvellous, but not with oos. That chap's climbing. There's a B in the spelling. Does this mean that it's climb and that he's climbing? No. Except in Nigeria and West Africa, where it's widely believed, well, it's widely the case, that this word locally is pronounced climb, purely on the basis of the spelling, because that B hasn't been pronounced in core English, mainstream English, for many, many centuries. It's just a funny thing in the spelling. Sometimes spellings are really ambiguous. The spelling at the top there, it can either mean entrance or it can mean entrance. American English, entrance. So it's either the way in or it's to bewitch, to absorb, to interest very deeply. You can't tell from the spelling, but of course you normally can tell from the context. As a side issue, I was recently advising a publisher who wants to produce a handheld electronic dictionary that will speak everything aloud, not just the head words, which are available already, but all sorts of examples. And one of the real problems that it proves they haven't yet solved, the software company doing this text-to-speech stuff haven't yet solved, is the problem of words that are spelt the same but pronounced differently, homographs. So we had an example where somebody had to wind up a mechanism and it produced wind up instead, because wind and wind are spelt in exactly the same way. And, well, you've got to intervene. You've got to check through the whole dictionary really and check each case and make sure that the software chooses the right one. There's no other way out of it. Well, I gave you some other examples of this. The verb and adjective to separate and separate, pronounced differently but spelt the same. And then if we also had the verb to document and the noun a document, which similarly are distinct because the verb keeps a strong vowel in the suffix, to document, just as to implement. and the noun, a document, an implement, weakens it. Well, at least it does at present for core native speakers of English. Of course, on the whole, those who learn English as a foreign language don't know about this. And these are all rather learned words. And maybe this is something that cannot be sustained in English, because really it's only people who learn these words in practice, probably in school as children, who are going to preserve this contrast of pronunciation. If you learn them purely as written words, you're not going to learn this difference of pronunciation. Another interesting case is the difference that all native speakers, I think, not quite sure about all Indians and Africans, but certainly Europeans, Americans, Australians and so on, distinguish between south and the vowel of southern. We have a switch from ow to up as we add the suffix, south, southern. In fact, it's just the same as the difference between profound and profundity, renounce and renunciation, but in those cases it's shown in the spelling. The odd thing about southern is it's not shown in the spelling. There's one more interesting case, which is pronounce and the Asian form of that, which traditionally is spelt and pronounced pronunciation. But here there is clearly a very big trend among native speakers to say, and therefore also to write correspondingly, pronunciation. As it is, I always correct it in my students' work, and make sure that it's correctly spelt with N-U-N pronunciation. But who knows? I was noticing Kofi Annan of the United Nations the other day, and he pronounced this word southern. And he's a very good speaker of English, of course, although not a native speaker. I don't think he would call himself a native speaker, though he has a very excellent command of language, obviously. Maybe this, again, is something that's not sustainable. We'll come back to this when we talk about Jennifer Jenkins's work in a few minutes. Before we do that, though, I want to suggest that one very good way of consolidating these ideas about the dynamic nature of speech production and speech recognition, indeed, is to do a little exercise which is appropriate for those of you who are going to take the IPA exam on Monday, where you have to do an articulatory description of a word or phrase in English. So I'm going to ask for help from the audience of those doing the IPA exam, and I'm going to behave as a robot. That is, I will carry out exactly and only the instructions you give me. And here I am, breathing happily through my nose, saying nothing, and I want you to program me to pronounce the English word stamp. So, I'm awaiting instructions. I reserve the right to take such necessary action as may arise in order to breathe and, stay alive, and to make commentaries from time to time. But, all right, here I am. See if you can get me to start off by making an S.
Raise your velum. Put the tip of the tongue near the teeth ridge, and start sending your aggressive harmonic here through your open glottis.
Open your mouth. Open your mouth.
Separate your lips.
All right. Well, that reminds you not to forget little things like opening your lips. Yeah. Now, if I do just that, we get something like this.
Okay.
What have you forgotten?
Open your lips. Ask you to articulate again the tip of the tongue against the teeth ridge. So
Yes.
Make it.
You haven't told me anything about the sides of the tongue.
Oh.
That's why you can't hear.
I usually forget about that. Just
Well, I did. I was saying, I got to raise the side ribs.
Raise.
Okay, and produce this groove in the middle there. All right, yes. So, lips open, glottis open, soft palate up, tongue tip up to alveolar ridge, sides in contact, blade, between the blade and the alveolar ridge, there's a groove. Send air down it. All right, that's right. The groove is essential because the air has to be deflected to hit the lower teeth. So I mustn't move the jaw too much. Well, I didn't, because you didn't tell me anything about the jaw, but it might be worth mentioning that. If I'd said, you wouldn't have heard anything. So jaw doesn't move much. All right, we've got to this stage. Now I want you to take me on from S to making the whole phase of the T.
The alveolar ridge would make contact.
Good, that's all that's necessary. Raise the tongue tip up to the alveolar ridge. And that's the whole phase of the T. Now let's see if we can get from the whole phase of the T to the vowel A.
Release the tongue.
But the front of the tongue moves to the open position. And your vocal folds must come lightly together so that the air producing friction, a bit of noise.
Producing friction?
No. Some voice.
Da. Okay.
Now lower your rhythm.
Da.
Raise our lips together. Lower the rhythm.
Okay, good. That's the crucial thing. As I bring my lips together, I think it's advisable to raise my jaw a bit. I lowered my jaw with my tongue, which is the default thing. When the tongue goes down, the jaw goes down. And when the tongue, well, the jaw's got to come up again. Stand, yes. Good about the velum. You didn't really tell me exactly when to start the vibration of the vocal folds with reference to the release of the alveolar closure. Is it immediately or is there a delay? Slight delay gives you sta. Is this an aspirated T? No, so no delay really. Trivial delay. Not more than 10 milliseconds, you know, so ignore it. Say no delay. Sta. Okay. Velum down, top letter down, sta. You're right, there is a little bit of nasalization at the end of the vowel. Lips come together, jaw comes up with them, stand. Right, we're nearly there. Now what have we got to do? Stand. Stand.
Raise your velum and let the ear compress behind the lips. Suddenly.
Stand. What have you forgotten? Stop the vocal folds, yes. Vocal folds stop pretty much at the moment when the velum makes contact. This changes the aerodynamics, and so the backwash stops the vocal folds vibrating. Stand. So during the hold we have no voicing. Stand. And the release is actually sort of optional. You could alternatively tell me just to stop pushing with the lungs. Stand. Or do other things like having the glottis closed.
Normally again.
Stand. Thank you. Yes, breathe normally again. Okay. Well, that's, as you can see, a valuable exercise because it does remind you of things that you otherwise would take for granted, but nevertheless which need to be described. Right. Thank you for the audience help. Let's now consider some of the other dynamic things that we've noticed about words in context in English. We learnt about weak forms. He said that he'd come. We don't say he said that he would come, or he said that he'd come. He said that he'd come, where we've got weakening of various kinds in various function words. We learnt about linking R. How, if we're saying how many eggs we want for breakfast, we say 4 eggs. Well, we don't have to. We can say 4 eggs, but usually we say 4 eggs. We'll also have noticed the interesting phenomenon of intrusive R, where if the eggs were raw, uncooked, we might call them raw eggs. We learnt about elision, the omission of certain sounds. How in the phrase first things first, we normally omit the T in first and normally say first things first. First things first. This is very important for those of you whose languages don't have final consonant clusters, because it is quite pointless to exercise yourself saying first with a t there, putting everything in when we don't have it normally there for native speakers before a following consonant. First things first. First things first. We studied assimilation, how instead of good morning, we often say good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. We've studied syllabic consonants in words like suddenly, three syllables, but one of those syllables is carried not by an ordinary vowel but by a syllabic consonant. We discussed compression, where rather than several cameras, we tend to speak of several cameras. We've discussed all sorts of allophonic effects, how sounds are pronounced in particular contexts. And so you know that in the phrase quite right, there are various options. You can put the T and the R together, making a affricate out of it, quite right. Or you can replace the T with a glottal stop, quite right. Or there are various other possibilities, quite right. We learnt about stress shift. Double stressed words like academic, when they're in context, followed by another strong stress, like accent, normally undergo this stress shift effect, where it's only the first syllable that gets an accent on it. Academic dress. Academic, academic dress. 15 and 15 people. He's unknown, but an unknown author. It's made of bamboo, but a bamboo curtain, and so on. We've also studied intonation. And so we've looked at the three systems of tonality, tonicity, and tone, as they're sometimes known. This is my favourite example, thank you, Michael Ashby, of tonality. What's that in the road ahead? Versus what's that in the road ahead? All right, a silly example, but it makes the point, doesn't it? That we need to break things up into chunks appropriately. And on the whole, this is just simple logic and it's quite obvious. We learnt about tonicity, about placing the nucleus within each intonation phrase. And we saw that by default, it's placed on the last content word, the last lexical item. So we say, what's all the fuss about? Why don't we say what's all the fuss about? Because about is a preposition. And we don't accent prepositions unless there's some special reason to do so. Have you had a letter from her? We don't normally say, have you had a letter from her, unless we're making contrast between her and somebody else. We don't say, have you had a letter from her, unless we're making a contrast between from and some other preposition, a letter to her. So the default, the norm is, have you had a letter from her? Who are you talking to? Not who are you talking to. Difficult to envisage a circumstance in which you want to emphasize to as against some other preposition there. So, who are you talking to? Why are you avoiding me? If you say, why are you avoiding me, it means a contrast with other people that you might avoid. Again, difficult to contextualize. It's the normal thing, why are you avoiding me? French mispronunciation, why are you avoiding me? Okay, sorry, caricature of French, but anyhow, this is the kind of problem that some learners of English do now. Lots and lots of learners have problems with compound nouns and compound stress. I want to change my library book. Nucleus goes online because this is a compound noun. If you were to say, I want to change my library book, the only inference would be that you were making a contrast between a book and something else from the library, not my library ticket. not my library records, but my library book. Of course, that's very improbable. So the normal thing, my library book. And if you say, I want a library book, to a native speaker, we're going to assume that you mean what you say, and we're going to look and try and understand this contrast that you seem to be making, which, if you didn't intend it, means that the whole conversation has gone off in the wrong direction. Similarly, I'm going to buy some running shoes. Shoes for running. That's a compound noun. Different, therefore, from running water, which is water that runs. Running shoes. How would we say the next sentence? Have you paid the entrance fee? Where does the nucleus go? End. Have you paid the entrance fee? Compound noun. It's time to submit a progress report. Pro. Or an American crown. It's time to submit a progress report. It's time to submit a progress report. But not on report, no. That would be in contrast to a progress something else. This is a compound noun. Thousands, tens of thousands of compound nouns in English. The vast majority of them follow this pattern. More function words. He keeps worrying about it. Just received a letter from her. We've looked at those already. What about this one? I can run faster than you can. Can we say, I can run faster than you can? Nonsense. If you say that, I start thinking, oh, what on earth is this about? You can. Well, Americans say to can, meaning to put things in cans, which we call to tin. How fast can you can things? No, this is a repeated item, and so it doesn't get accented. Don't accent repeated words. On the contrary, we put the nucleus on the words that are not repeated, the words where there is a contrast. You've told me what Emma wants. What do you want? Contrast between Emma and you. He promised he'd finish it, but actually he didn't finish it. What's the contrast here? It's a contrast of tense and polarity. He said he would finish it, but actually he didn't finish it. Conditional positive, past tense negative. She said it was wrong, but he said it was right. Contrast of pronouns, she and he, and contrast of right and wrong. So we regularly accent words which are put into contrast. But this is part of the speaker's control over the conversation. It's for the speaker to decide what to focus on, what to put into contrast. If you don't sort of control this in intonation, you're missing out on your control of the conversation. Some people, I mean Brazel and his followers, see conversation as a kind of battleground between two speakers, vying for control, vying to be dominant, or sometimes to be deferential, as is appropriate. I don't really look at conversation in quite such a militaristic kind of way, but it certainly is true that when we speak, we try and steer the conversation in particular ways by focusing on things by our use of intonation, indicating what we think is important. One of the things that we tend to de-accent is final adverbs of time or place. And we do this even when they have new information. So we often say things like, I had an unexpected letter yesterday. We don't have to, we can also say, I had an unexpected letter yesterday, putting a sort of subordinate rising tone on the yesterday. She's coming to dinner tomorrow. Or we can say, she's coming to dinner tomorrow. We have a choice over it. Now, I think I mentioned earlier that the intonation of English and the other Germanic languages tends to be very similar, but this is a clear point of difference between English and German. Partly because of word order rules, you can't put these adverbs finally in German, or at least not all of them, and not very happily. But I think you can't do this sort of pattern in German like you do in English. She's coming to dinner tomorrow. There's a mosquito on your finger. There's another one. Even though the finger is previously unmentioned, we don't have to emphasize it. Here's an example of a difference between different languages that I've borrowed from Hector Ortiz Lira, who is a very good writer on English intonation, by the way. He's in Chile. He wrote a very interesting article about nucleus placement in English and Spanish, contrasting the two languages. And Spanish speakers from Spain tell me they don't like this example. It doesn't sound what they would say, but anyhow, this is his example. In English, if person A says, look, we're already late, B might answer, I don't care if we are late. I don't care if we are late. Nucleus on R, because late is repeated. The Spanish equivalent, according to Ortiz, is pero si estamos atrasados. Answer, no me importa si estamos atrasados. In other words, you can keep the nucleus on the same word even though it's repeated. I think a general point is probably correct between English and Spanish. Spanish allows a certain amount of accenting of repeated items. English strongly doesn't. Sometimes when we compare different languages, we can see that there is a similarity at a deeper level, even though on the surface there are differences. In English we give the rule accent, put the nucleus on the last lexical item. In German you can't really do this because you have these final verbs, or bits of verbs in German, which typically are unaccented. So the equivalent of the English I've lost my bag in German is ich habe meine Tasche verloren. You can say ich habe meine Tasche verloren, but that's a contrast. I've lost it rather than do something else with it. So we can't give that rule for German, but if we go a bit deeper, what we're doing in each case is accenting the last noun, or the last noun phrase. And that seems to be shared among all the Germanic languages. So it's a byproduct of the word order rules, the differences in word order rules, which obscures the common underlying things. One of the most important things, I think, tasks of the next 10, 20 years in intonation is to try and get deep down in a lot of different languages and see what is really universal and shared between different languages. What is different, and therefore language specific, and therefore needs to be taught and learnt. Because clearly in intonation a lot is shared universally, but a lot isn't, and that's what we need to concentrate on. Yes, accentuation, there are lots of nice simple examples that we can concentrate on in the classroom to give important lessons about. Like the fact that we don't accent one when it follows an adjective, when it doesn't really mean the number one. So we're talking about waves, that's a big one. A big one. This, on the other hand, is a big one, because it's a large figure, one. Yes, are you asking me or telling me? This is something we signal in many languages by intonation. Some languages more than others. In Spanish, in Greek, the difference between a statement and a yes-no question depends entirely on intonation, because there's no difference in the words. In English, we have usually this reversal of the order of the verb operator and the subject. In some other languages, in Polish, you stick a ch in at the beginning. In Japanese, you stick a ka in at the end. So languages differ in what exactly they do. In Chinese, I believe you repeat the verb positive and negative. In English, we do it sort of supporting it by intonation. The intonation isn't usually crucial, though it might be. Usually there are other indications. But these other things can be confusingly different. In English, when we have a WH question, we normally do it with a for. What's the time? How do you want your eggs? Where are you going? We can soften it by making it with a rise, but that's the norm. So where are you from? I'm told that the Japanese equivalent normally has a rising tone. We can discuss this afterwards if this is not true, but I'm told that the Japanese equivalent of where are you from is Doko kara kita no desu ka? With a ka rising at the end. If that's true, well then this is something that Japanese learners would need to learn about, so as not to sound always softening everything in English. But if you want a serious answer to a serious question, you've certainly got to give a falling tone on the WH question. Which brings us to Jennifer Jenkins's ideas about English as an international language. She points out very rightly that English is increasingly used between people who are not native speakers of it, between people for whom it's a foreign language in both cases, or a second language. And she says, really, given that that's true, why should we go on insisting on all the difficult things in English pronunciation which may be irrelevant when a Swede is talking to a Japanese or when an Italian is talking to an Indian? And so she proposes a sort of stripped down version of English pronunciation. She really talks much more about pronunciation than she does about grammar, though it seems to me that anything that we say about pronunciation has its analogue in grammar. If, following Jenkins, we say, well, let's not bother about TH sounds, about difficult sound contrasts in general, why should we bother about difficult things in grammar, like the article and the use of the article? Why bother? Indeed, why bother about singular versus plural? Chinese, Japanese do perfectly well without it. Korean, why do we need it in English? And all the complications that come with that. All these S endings on verbs in the singular, not in the plural. S ending on a noun in the plural, not in the singular. Very confusing. Let's get rid of that. There are all sorts of other things. What about the aspect difference? The difference between do you smoke and are you smoking? Has a clear difference of meaning to native speakers of English, but difficult for many learners. So why bother with that? And the same sort of thing applies in pronunciation, which Jenkins sort of partly recognises. And so she does say, well, we do still need to worry about the BV contrast, the RL contrast, the S-ch contrast, ch-j, y-j, and so on. We do, according to her, still need to worry about aspiration, about long and short vowels, E, E, and R. She even, by implication, requires us to go on with U, O, which, as I suggested to you a few days ago, is perhaps not worth bothering about. It isn't clear whether her model requires us to distinguish E and A. It does seem to require us to learn the difficult vowel or its American equivalent Now, from a typological point of view, languages of the world, very, very few languages have a stressed long sound or a stressed sound. It does so happen that one other language that does have an sound is the very widely spoken Mandarin Chinese. So perhaps, you know, that those two very widely spoken languages, American English and Mandarin Chinese, both happen to have this which is perhaps more of a case for learning to make it. Jenkins doesn't approach the problem of phonotactics, that, as we've seen, is a difficult area, nor does she consider the matter of nucleus placement. So on the whole, I feel a bit sceptical about Jenkins's claims. And let me tell you instead what I think we ought to do as our aims in teaching pronunciation of English, or in general, teaching any language. I think we ought to recognise that achieving native-like performance may be impossible in many cases, but I nevertheless feel that we ought to try and aim towards it. My own personal aim in learning foreign languages is to try and make myself as native-like as I possibly can. Now, I may or may not achieve this, but at least that's my aim and intention. It's a matter of individual aspiration, in the sense of aspiring towards something. Not everybody may have this wish. Others may say, no, all I want to do is to be able to exchange letters or read books or write stuff on the internet. Others may say, well, I'm happy as long as I can make myself understood and understand what others are saying to me. This is part of the learner's rights to decide what your aim is in language learning. I'm all in favour of empowering learners rather than laying down the law to them. But there are also going to be those who seek excellence and will join me in wanting to be perfect, even if we don't succeed always in achieving perfection. I wanted to finish by mentioning that there are lots of useful resources that you can call on. This is part of the departmental website, teaching about phonetics. Go and look at the instructions about our MA program, for example, which is also on the website. There's a vast mass of stuff on the departmental website, and it grows all the time, so go and look about it, search for what you can find there. You may know, some of you, I'm now doing a daily blog on phonetic topics. Well, you know, that too has links to other places, and that's just UCL. There's the vast world of the internet becoming available. I think that the internet revolution is the most important development really since the invention of printing. And we are very privileged that we're here at the beginning of it, and we can take part in it. 10 years ago, it was still something that only a very few people knew about. I did have my homepage 10 years ago, I'm very proud to say, but there wasn't an awful lot on it, and there weren't very many other homepages. But now this is something that is ongoing, and let's all join in and take part in it. I hope that we may have enthused you enough by our work this year that you will encourage your friends, your students, or even perhaps yourselves to come back next year. I'm sure it'll be excellently run, probably better than this year. So with that we finish and say yes, goodbye, and thank you everybody. Thank you. I'll see you all at the party after your last practical class.
This is a special song for Professor John Wells, commemorating his happy retirement.
Thank you.
You are sunshine, phonetic sunshine. You make us happy.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming to the party. I wish you a safe journey home, and I hope to see you somewhere in the future, either when you come back to England or when I come to your country in my retirement. Goodbye.